Okay, so the title of this video will be using the title of this document, what it looks like to use someone else's theory or ideas to evaluate your own ideas, thinking, reasoning, and I guess really what I should have there is a backslash for argument. Now, I want you to keep in mind that this is only presenting the gist of what it looks like to use somebody else's point of view, their concepts, their ideas, their definitions, their theory. It's just the gist. Don't take this too literally. And in fact, we're not even going to use the same topic with respect to the main topic for this video and document. So as you know, for the task that you're currently working on, there are two parts. You're going to have the part where you copy and paste from another task you completed. And so you can just title that part one. And then, and I don't think I told you to do that in the main video. And so some of you, there might be some students who didn't listen to this video because they didn't want to look at the examples. The examples aren't required. This is optional. But it's cool if you do have part one as a subtitle, but it's not necessary. But this is just for you to imagine, that a student, this is our imaginary student who has submitted example one, has copied and pasted something that they wrote earlier in the semester. Now, in the example that I am giving, the example is not that a student wrote an argument earlier in the semester. They wrote more like an explanation. So just imagine that the student here has posted for part one verbatim something that they wrote earlier in the semester in the form of a paragraph, and it had to do with some lesson that they learned. And then imagine that immediately below it in part two, they are evaluating a response that they gave to something through the lens of me, Dr. Carrillo, and what I think about intellectual humility. So really what's going on then in my example is the student here in the original argument, let's pretend that they are that they wrote about whether or not they've reflected intellectual humility when it comes to argument work. And so now this is the part that I want you to notice, okay? So notice the part in yellow. The words in yellow are the kinds of phrases, the kind of language, linguistic devices I should see when I see you talking about what Bentham might say about your item 3 response. The item in blue is the kind of phrase I should see that provides the gist of an overall evaluation, an overall judgment. And then the stuff that's in bold is an example or an indication of where the student is quoting from their original response as they discuss how I, Dr. C, through my concept of intellectual humility, would evaluate their discussion and application of intellectual humility to something that they experienced. So again, this is not the same topic. This example is more about the gist. So let's read through it. If Dr. C were to look at how I talked about intellectual humility before starting the first argument module, I think she would call attention to the fact that I failed to make the required intellectual moves in my conclusion that I strongly supported intellectual humility. And now what I'm realizing is that that is a self-quote as well. So notice what we have here in yellow. If Dr. C were to look at how I talked about, for this task, you wouldn't mention Dr. C, you'd have to mention the full name of the philosopher whose theory you are applying. And, make sure that you say that you name his theory at some point. If so-and-so was to look at what I wrote through his theory of, or something like that. Notice what I have here. I think she would call attention to the fact that, right? So just notice that. And then notice how they're saying, here's what she would call my attention to. And then here they are quoting something from their own response, right? Then look at what the actual critique would be that they think that I would make, that they failed to make something, that they failed to make the required intellectual moves, okay? So then we move on and it says, for example, because so now the student is giving a specific example. Your response for this task is only a paragraph long. So it could be that the speaker has failed to make a number of moves, but the speaker or the writer also knows that they only have a paragraph to show how I, Dr. C, through my concept of intellectual humility, might evaluate the speaker or writer's own application of intellectual humility in and actually in my little hypothetical piece for up here, supposedly the student was arguing that they reflected intellectual humility. And again, this is just the gist. This is not somebody evaluating a response in terms of someone's theory and how they answered an ethical dilemma, as you did in item 3. Again, this is just the gist of what it looks like to talk about how someone else might respond to something you did with respect to what they think is important. So then they say, for example, she might point out that I failed to make explicit the official definition I was working with when talking about whether or not I reflected the intellectual virtue at that point in time. So again, notice the language. She might point out that. I think she would have called attention to that. If Dr. C were to look at how I talked about. Okay, then we've got, she might also point out that I did not explicitly connect key concepts in the definition, such as readily admitting and limits of my own knowledge to that point in time. That is when the student was applying the concept of intellectual humility to their memory of first working through some soft talk modules on argument analysis. So again, let me back up. So again, notice how we're wording things in yellow, okay? So instead of she, you'll be saying he, right? And in this example, you see the focus is on weaknesses in original response that they gave, right? So you might focus on weaknesses, you might focus on strengths that Bentham might note in your response, given what you learned about his thinking in the principle of utility and the hedonic calculus. Okay, so what's really important here is that the student is lifting from my theory, my ideas, my thinking about intellectual humility. They're saying these are words that name fundamental and powerful concepts that Dr. C emphasizes in her theory from her point of view when it comes to intellectual humility. So you want to make sure that you are embedding explicitly key words, key terms, or definitions, or principles that name fundamental and powerful concepts or reveal some important aspects of Bentham's theory as well. Then it says, furthermore, she would point out that my discussion sounds like it's more about intellectual perseverance. And so she might also tell me that my discussion does not have the proper focus, okay? This leads me to believe that she would say my response is far from satisfactory. All right, so another thing that I do not want you to do, I do not want to see in your response that you literally took each of these things in yellow and just tried to treat this like a fill in the blank. So this is not a template, okay? And sometimes I'll have students do that, and that's almost plagiarizing, and you will get points off if you do that. It's okay, obviously you can borrow from these phrases to set up your phrases that you need, right? So I'm not saying you can't say, I think Bentham would call attention to that. I think you can say things like, I think Bentham would focus on this. I think Bentham would note this. I think, whatever. But please do not just, lift what's in yellow directly and then just try to do a fill in the blank. That's not it. Also, depending on what you wrote in your original argument, right? That's going to really determine what you decide Bentham is likely to say based on what you learned about his normative theory, his moral thinking about deciding right and wrong. Again, the gist is just to see what does it sound like? And so to that extent, what does it look like in writing to show that you're showing how somebody else, through their theory, through their concepts, through their points, might evaluate your argument. And of course, in evaluating their argument, they are analyzing your argument. So what this also entails as we're reading through this is the speaker or writer is showing how Dr. C might take apart what they say, how Dr. C analyzed and broke down parts of what they said in their response, and how that leads to some overall evaluation. So for yours, you could say things like, Bentham would find my response satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Overall, he would say my response is good. Overall, he would say my response is bad. He might say that some parts of my response are good, some parts of my response are lacking. He might say that there are some strengths to be noted in my response while there are weaknesses. So there are all kinds of evaluative claims you can make on behalf of Bentham, but of course you can't misrepresent him. You can't distort how he thinks. Okay, so let's look at example 2. And again, it's just, we're looking at the gist. What does it sound like to write up a discussion where you're showing what somebody else might say through their definitions, their concepts, their theories about something that you already wrote? Okay, so, and also notice, we can see here that this is a student who wrote something about intellectual humility, right? That they strongly reflected intellectual humility in the arguments. They argued for that, so they gave reasons for that. What you don't see, and and this is something they did correct in this paragraph, is they do not say what Dr. C would say. So you don't see them saying, Dr. C would say, I did reflect intellectual humility when I was working through that soft talk lesson. That's not the point. The point is not to apply in this paragraph, the point is not to apply the concept of intellectual humility or doctors thinking about intellectual humility directly to whether or not, the student reflected intellectual humility. No, the point is to show how Dr. C might evaluate their application or argument for the claim that they strongly reflected intellectual humility. And of course, they have to use Dr. Carrillo's definition of intellectual humility in doing so, and any instructions she gave with respect to how they should do that. So same thing here. Here, you do not see them talking about how Dr. C would argue they reflected intellectual humility or not. No, that was the student's job in their original response. They were supposed to give an argument as to whether or not they reflected intellectual humility while working through an argument module. They don't show how Dr. C might argue that the student really reflected intellectual humility. No, that's not the point of this discussion. The point of this discussion is to show how would Dr. C evaluate, their claim and how they got to the claim and whether they sufficiently supported their claim about something. So let's look at, and by the way, I want to go back up here. This student did a really good job. So this would be an A-level response. So even though the student is saying Dr. C would say that the response is far from satisfactory, that it has many weaknesses and failures, the student does a really good job showing that. So they would get an A. Let's look at this one. This is also an example of an A-level response. So based on what I have learned about Dr. C's take on intellectual virtue and intellectual humility in particular, I think she would say, I have done a great job thinking through my response to the prompt. So there's their overall evaluative judgment, right? And notice the language again. I think she would say, she might say, I thought through. For example, she would note that. She might also point out that. For example, she might focus on when I said. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at it. I have done a great job thinking through my response to the prompt. The prompt asked whether I reflected intellectual humility just when I was about to start the first soft talk module on my argument. What I really like about that is that the student's giving a little bit of context. I think it would be cool if you had a sentence of context telling me, what it is that you're analyzing. Say something about, why did you construct that argument? When did you construct that argument? What was the conclusion that you had argued for? Or something, just a sentence that gives a little context, is the argument that you're analyzing from Bentham's point of view from earlier point in the semester? If so, what assignment? What were you supposed to do? Something like that, but just a sentence. So I reflected intellectual humility just when I was about to, okay, whatever. She might say, I thought through all the necessary elements of the prompt using all relevant concepts, definitions, and instructions exactly as instructed. So that's fine, but the student does a good job not staying there. So that might be true, but they need to give an example because that's just too general and fuzzy. So since they have only a paragraph, the speaker or writer knows that they can't show all the ways or demonstrate all the ways that Dr. C might show that the student, made use of all concepts, definitions, and instructions exactly as instructed. But they know that they need to be a little bit more precise. So an example is offered. For example, she would note that I did make explicit the definition for intellectual humility I had in mind. in defending my claim that my mindset was aligned with what it means to be intellectually humble about a given topic, concept, or lesson. She might also point out I did a great job embedding keywords and hence concepts from the definitions and bullet points into my support for the claim that I manifested intellectual humility just when I was about to start the respective module. For example, she might focus on when I said, just as I was about, so here the student's doing a self-quote. Here I don't have it in bold, I have it underlined. Oh, and actually I realized up here, this is bolded because that's a quote from Dr. C in terms of her theory of intellectual humility. And now I realize that this should be not bolded, but underlined because it's a quote from the student's own response. Sorry about that. You guys know that I often catch mistakes later in a lecture, so that's why you always want to read or follow a video all the way through to the end. Okay, so for example, she might focus on when I said, just as I was about to start the soft talk module on intellectual humility, I was aware that while I use the word argument many times in my everyday life and even in a debate club, philosophy might have some new light to shed light on the topic. This means I was admitting the limits of my own knowledge. That's a pretty long quote. Make sure that if you have any self quotes, they shouldn't take up, they shouldn't be longer than this one. I do think that you want to provide enough of a quote. You should quote yourself at least once in your response, but just be careful and adhere to what I say about at least half your sentences shedding light on something. She might emphasize, okay, so that is a sentence fragment, so maybe they just, okay, so this is just a typo right here. Should be, she might emphasize, something weird happened there. How I explicitly use words that name key concepts within the respective definition for intellectual humility, such as aware, admitting limits, and knowledge. And of course, they're pulling out these words, and what the writer is saying is, these are words that are important to Dr. Carrillo, and she's going to notice that these words were used in my original response. Okay. All right. So again, this is just the gist. The focus is really on what does it sound like, and hence what does it read like. And of course, this gets an A level, an A. What does it sound like, and what does it read like when you are talking about how somebody else would talk about your response? In neither of these examples is the student showing how Dr. C would argue that the student did or did not reflect intellectual humility. No, the student is talking about how Dr. C would evaluate the student's argument that they did or did not reflect intellectual humility. All right, so I know that the start of this video started off kind of rocky. At the beginning, I said that the student didn't offer an argument or that they were just explaining, but in truth, I forgot that the context for my example creations were, in fact, in my imagination, that the student had constructed an argument that they had or had not reflected intellectual humility prior to starting a soft talk lesson, so I apologize for that from the beginning. That said, you still got some, I hope you still got a sense of what it sounds and hence reads like to evaluate, talk about, analyze your response or a response from someone else's perspective.